Okay, so we're here on this day of Yom Yerushalayim, which I'm going to mention something about that to start off. We're up to chapter 20, Perek Kaf, the second to last chapter in the book of Shofetim. And before I introduce the chapter, I just thought to mention just a brief point about Yerushalayim, because that is the day that it is today. Yom Yerushalayim is the day in which we remember that 54 years ago in 1967, we regained control of the old city. Subsequently, there was peace discussions and we gave back the Temple Mount and different things. But for at least a brief moment, we saw the power of Hashem helping out our armed forces and the miracles that Hashem is capable of as we rebuffed all of the Arab nations that came to attack us in just 6 days. The casualties were nowhere near what they thought they were going to be. And a crisis was averted, but not just averted, we tripled the size of the state of Israel. We took on territory that we never had before. And it was really a turning point for the state of Israel in just 19 years after it had declared its independence. And so the city of Yerushalayim is so dear to us. It's central to everything about our religion. 3 times a year, we have to go to the city of Yerushalayim on a pilgrimage to come to the house of Hashem and offer sacrifices and be with our brothers and sisters from all over and celebrate the greatness of Hashem and being a member of Am Yisrael together. We pray always facing Eretz Yisrael, and those who are in Eretz Yisrael pray facing Yerushalayim. It's the funnel, so to speak, of all of the prayers of the Jewish people towards Hashem. And one thing that I guess we can take away from the book of Shoftim in our studies that have been going on for the last several months is that we've been highlighting a lot of what happens when you don't have good leadership, when you don't have a king to unify the people. But a king always comes with his city. And eventually we make our way in the next books to David HaMelech and establishing the city of Yerushalayim and his son Shlomo, building the Beit HaMikdash. One of the missing pieces that is highlighted by the book of Shoftim is not just a king who's missing, a person to unify the government and the Jewish people, but also his city, which will be the eye of the Jewish people, as the Torah says, the makom asher yivhar Hashem, the place that God is going to choose. During this period of time of the Shoftim, we have the Mishkan, but the Mishkan seems to not be a draw for the people. They don't seem to be inspired to gravitate, towards it. It does stand for 369 years and is the place to offer sacrifices and would be the de facto central place for the Jewish people, but its lack of permanence, its lack of structure, just doesn't move the people to rally around it. As we'll see at the beginning of the book of Shemuel, which is our next book coming up in a few weeks, only select people went and visited the Mishkan to offer sacrifices on the holidays. It was not something that people were drawn to. It wasn't until David comes on the scene, establishes his fortress in the city of Yerushalayim, and lays the groundwork for his son building the Beit HaMikdash, which really launches the Jewish kingdom into its glory. And so parallel to what we've been talking about in the book of Shoftim, which is a lack of leadership and the catastrophic results of that, also a lack of a central city, a place of a Beit HaMikdash where everybody can come and rally around, that is rooted heavily in the traditions of the Jewish people, is something that also leads to many of the problems that we've been reading about in the book of Shoftim. Just go a couple of chapters ago where they set up the temple of Micha and the idol of Micha. If you had a Beit HaMikdash, that would probably be a less tempting situation. But because the Mishkan was not what the Beit HaMikdash was, it was not beyond the realm that the people would set up an alternative place to worship Hashem. 100%. Yeah. And so I think on this day, as we've been going through the book of Shoftim, we certainly have a sense of appreciation and gratitude for the city of Yerushalayim, for what it stands for, and what we are hopefully praying for it to be completed. We say it in our prayers during the Amidah every day. We say it in our Birkat HaMazon prayers, Bonei Yerushalayim, to fully rebuild the city of Yerushalayim to its past glory as the central heartbeat of the Jewish people. With that in mind, we turn our attention to our chapter 20 of the book of Judges. In chapter 19, we read the horrific story of the concubine at Giv'ah, her abuse, the rape, and we left off the chapter with her body being chopped up, for lack of a better term, and sent to all of the Jewish people as a warning for what is taking place in the nation of Israel. And now chapter 20 is going to be the Jewish people's reaction to this terrible story. There will be some positives in here, many negatives as well. And overall, the story will be quite heartbreaking when we read about civil war and the death of thousands upon thousands of Jews at their own hands because of this lack of unity and this terrible tragedy that occurred. So let's read the chapter pasuk by pasuk. We'll see what happens. We'll make several comments and we'll try to understand some of the difficult aspects that this chapter will present to us. So, like we said, we pick up with the Jewish people reacting to the Pilegesh Begiv'ah story. Vayetzeu kol bnei Yisrael vatikahel ha'edah ke'ish echad. The Jewish people all go out and they gather together in a congregation as one man. Lemidan ve'ad Be'er Sheva, from Dan to Be'er Sheva, ve'eretz ha'gil'ad. So Be'er Sheva is the tribes of Yehuda and Shimon. Dan is the more southern tribes. Gil'ad are the northern tribes of Ephraim and Menashe. And these are the major tribes that comprise the Jewish population. They all gather together El Adonai B'mitzpah, before God in a place called Mitzpah. So right away, just in the first pasuk, we see something that we've yet to see in the entire book of Judges. We see the Jewish people come together. And we won't like the reason that they're coming together. It's not a great cause. We would have hoped that we had heard this when we were fighting our true enemies instead of ourselves. But at the very least, we're seeing unity for something, right? A ki'ish ehad, like one person. That phrase harkens to the receiving of the Torah. When the rabbis tell us that the Jewish people stood at the foot of Har Sinai, ki'ish ehad belev ehad, like one man with one heart. So at least we're rallying together for something. All hope is not lost in that the Jewish people as a whole are not going to tolerate this kind of behavior, even from members of their own clan. Verse 2, Vayityatzvu pinot kol ha'am kol shevtei Yisrael, all the leaders of the people and all of the tribes stood presenting themselves, Bikhal am ha'elohim, in the assembly of God, Arba me'ot elef ish ragli, Sholef Harev, 400,000 fighting men, the largest number we have seen in the book of Shofetim to date, all of whom with a Sholef Harev, with a sword in their hand, ready to fight. They know what this tragedy can bring. Vayishme'u bnei Binyamin, in verse 3, the tribe of Binyamin hears Ki alu bnei Yisrael ha-mitzpah, that the rest of the nation has gathered to Mitzpah, which is a fortress, a place of battle, and they are ready for war. Vayomeru bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people say, Daberu echa nihiyeta hara'ah hazot. Tell us, how did this evil thing happen? So again, we see another positive on the part of the Jewish people. They restrain themselves. They do not immediately attack the people of Binyamin, assuming the worst. They want more information. They're going to send a delegation to figure out what's going on. This speaks a little bit to what we saw at the end of the book of Yehoshua, when the tribes on the other side of the Jordan River built that tower, and we assumed the worst. Oh, they're trying to disengage from the rest of the Jewish people. And Yehoshua sent out the delegation of Pinchas and others to figure out what was going on before we actually got into civil war. So there we had another threat of civil war that was averted, that crisis was averted because of a delegation. So we play on that and try to see, maybe we could avert this crisis as well. Now, who should stand up amongst everybody? In verse 4, that very same Levite, the Levi, who was the husband of this concubine and threw her to the wolves, as we said. He is certainly not, by any stretch of the imagination, an innocent person in this story. While he did prompt the reaction of the rest of the Jewish people by sending the pieces of his wife's mangled body to the rest of the nation, it pains us to even say it, so at least he did arouse the feelings of the rest of the Jewish people. He's certainly somebody who took part in this terrible travesty. He's not exonerated, and yet he will tell over what exactly happened, taking no responsibility for the events that happened to himself. Vayan ha'ish halevi, the man of the Levi, answers, Ish ha'isha ha'nirtzacha, the man of this wife who was murdered, vayomar, and he says, Now you're thinking by that introduction, he's a Levi, he's the husband of the one who was murdered. He should tell the story accurately. And he says, Hagiv'ata asher lebinyamin bati. I went to the Giv'ah, to the mountain of the tribe of Benjamin. Ani upilagshi lalun, me and my concubine to stay over for the night. Verse 5, Vayakumu alai ba'alei hagiv'ah, and the members of this tribe of the hill came upon me. Vayasobu alai et habayit laila, and they surrounded my home at night. All of this is true. Oti dimu laharog, me they wanted to kill, right? Ve'et pilagshi inu, and they abused and oppressed and raped my concubine, vatamot, and she died. Va'ohaz bapilagshi, and so I grabbed onto my concubine, va'anateheha, and I dismembered her, va'ashaleheha, and I sent her pieces, bechol seder nahalat Yisrael, in all of the fields of the Jewish people, ki asu zima'un v'ala b'Yisrael, because they performed promiscuity, depravity, and disgustingness amongst the Jewish people. Now, everything that he says here is true. None of it is false. But there are some glaring omissions in his recount of this story. He does not tell how he was at fault for traveling at night, how he didn't accept his father-in-law's invitation to stay, how he pushed her outside of the home and didn't stand up to the mob on her behalf and allowed that to happen, how he callously, dragged her, and like we said, perhaps even dismembered her alive to the rest of the people. So certainly the Isha Levi is not exonerated here from his actions, but he clearly omits them in his retelling to the Jewish people, because he's only interested in their reaction towards what they're going to do to the tribe of Binyamin. Why all of a sudden did he decide that something had to be done, that he was going to be the mission for this? Yeah, so why did he decide to be that person? I mean, it seems as though he still has, it seems as though, look, he's upset about what took place, right? I mean, definitely from the start, this was not his plan. He did not want his concubine to be dismembered. In a moment of panic, he acted in a disgusting way, but at the same time, he understands the tragedy that took place. He understands the terrible actions of the Jewish people and what it did to him and how it affected him. And so he's not going to stand for that. He's not going to take his rightful place in the actions that he did wrong, but he's not happy about what took place. And so he's rallying the troops, maybe not so much for a religious cause, maybe more for a personal cause, and he's getting everybody together. So we don't exactly know what's happening in his mind, but we do know at least he becomes a vehicle for some element of change, albeit he doesn't do what we would have hoped he would have done fully from beginning to end. Now he says to them in verse 7, Hine kulchem b'nei Yisrael, behold, now it's on you, Am Yisrael. Havu lachem davar ve'etzah halom. Produce a plan of action here and now. Vayakom kol ha'am ke'ish ehad lemor. The men stand up again, ki'ish ehad, meaning they are uniform in their decision here. Lo nelech ish le'aholo. We are not going back to our tent. We're not just letting this pass. Velo nasur ish lebeto, and we're not going to enter our houses. In other words, we're here to stay. Verse 9. Ve'ata zeh hadavar asher na'aseh leGiv'ah. Behold, this is what we're going to do to the people of Giv'ah in tribe of Binyamin. Aleha begoral. We're going to do it according to a lot. So they're going to draw a lottery here to determine something. What are they going to determine? It seems as though they're going to determine who's going to fight. Verse 10. Velakachnu asara anashim lame'ah. We're going to take 10 people from all of the tribes, 10 men to the 100. In other words, we have 400,000 people here. We don't need 400,000 people here to fight. We're going to reduce the number of soldiers. We've seen this before. Gideon, for example, did this. When you don't fight with everybody, but you sort of reduce your standing of how many soldiers you have. Gideon did it because he wanted to give credit to Hashem for the war. They're going to do it more because they don't feel like they need that many soldiers. They don't want everybody to go to battle. Maybe they want to try to avoid an issue with Binyamin. Not so sure. But they're going to take 10 people to the 100. One for every 10, basically, right? Lechol shivtei Yisrael, for all of the Jewish people, ume'ala elef, and 1,000 to the 10,000. Ve'elef narvava. So 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, 10 to 10, 1,000 to 10,000. Lakahat seda la'am, to prepare for their going to food and things like that, and needs and sustenance for the people. La'asot levo'am legeva binyamin, to prepare for their going to give for the tribe of Binyamin. So they're going to divide the war efforts and who's going to prepare food, who's going to do weaponry, who's going to be the ones that are fighting, and they're going to figure out based on ratio, however many people you have in your tribe, that's how many people ratio-wise, percentage-wise, you need to send to the battlefield. This is how many people you have to send to do the food for the warfare. In other words, they're preparing a full-on attack against the tribe of Binyamin, as if they were a foreign enemy. Verse 11, Vayasef kol ish Yisrael el ha'ir, all of the men of Israel gathered together to the city, ki ish ehad haverim, united in friends as one unit. Again, you see that language we've been hearing repetitively all throughout this chapter, ki ish ehad, like one people, haverim, beloved, friends. In other words, those who were on this side were together, were united, right? And so, I really love the words that Rabbi Hatton over here brings, which I think are really good. He calls it united to destroy. He says Israel's desire to uproot evil and to punish the perpetrators and those that harbor them indicates that there is yet hope for justice, right? There is still a shred of dignity, of respect, of honor, of morality left amongst the Jewish people. We haven't lost everything. As we're going to see in verse 12, I'll just read verse 12 for you quickly. They first send the delegation to all of the tribes of Binyamin, saying, what was this evil that you did? How could you have done this thing? And they say to them in verse 13, give up those people who did this scoundrel act, and let us put them to death. In other words, the people do a very noble thing. They said, look, we don't want to attack everybody. We don't want to kill all of you. We know you don't all deserve to die. We know it wasn't everybody. Hand over the people who you know who it was, and clearly it was well identified, and we'll put those people to death, and we'll end this crisis because of what they did. Let us burn out the evil from amongst the Jewish people. This is a phrase that we see in the Torah all the time. Burn out the evil, root out the evil from amongst you. But Binyamin, who had the power to avert the crisis now by simply giving them up, velo avu bnei Binyamin, they would not hear of it. Lishmoa bekol ahaim bnei Yisrael, to listen to the voices of their brethren amongst the Jewish people. And instead, in verse 14, vayasfu bnei Binyamin min ha'arim ha'giv'ata latzet milchama in bnei Yisrael. The tribes of Binyamin, the sons of Binyamin, all of the families gathered together from their cities of Giv'ah and other neighboring towns to go out to war against the Jewish people. As we'll see, the tribe of Binyamin is a fierce adversary. They are a very, very strong and well-populated tribe. There was a way to avert it. The Jews had hoped that they would avert it. But here is a difference from what we saw in Yehoshua. Instead of admitting their righteousness, instead of admitting what they did wrong, giving up those people and averting the crisis, they don't. They harbor the fugitives. That's what Rabbi Hatton says over here. But he says, not every vestige of ethics has been lost. Moreover, it is the first time in the book of Judges that we see the tribes of Israel come together, including those east of the Jordan River, who elsewhere tended to be apathetic to the fate of their comrades. At long last, Israel arises to do what is right and pure, free from the terrible scourge of tribalism and plagued and hampered the mission of every single judge in the book. The irony, he says, is amplified. He says, without doubt, both of these developments are encouraging. Paradoxically, however, all of this positive momentum is for the sake of extirpating another tribe in Israel, where the reader is like, where were you all these other chapters? In other words, why now? All of a sudden now, when it comes to our own people, we're willing to come and to attack. But all these tribes before, nothing happened. Huh? It's not answerable. In other words, it's I don't want to say it's typical us, right? But it's typical us. We can tend to be fiercer against ourselves than we are against our enemies. And Jewish history has showed this. Own worst enemy in how we act, and own worst enemy between each other. The fighting and the lack of loyalty is pretty astounding, right? So this is we're seeing some bright spots. There might be hope, but it just feels like too little, too late. Like where were we at this point? You know? Let's move to verse 15 and see a little bit more irony that is going to happen now. And we're going to see that we are firmly planted on the side of the rest of the Jewish people against the tribe of Binyamin. The tribe of Binyamin's actions over here is pretty deplorable. Not only did they allow people to do that amongst them, which means that that was the kind of culture they had, but as well, they harbor them. They harbor these terrible people and do not give them up. Verse 15. ויתפקדו בני בנימין ביום ההוא מהערים 26,000 איש שולף חרב. So the Benjaminites amassed their own army, and they come out of the cities to gather 26,000 fighters. Now, 26,000 is a nice number, not compared to 400,000, but it's a pretty nice number now when you're given also the fact that, right, and it's just one tribe, and we also narrowed down our army. Levad miyoshvei hagiv'ah hotpakedu 700 ish bahur. Mustered apart from the inhabitants of Giv'ah, 700 men. Mikol ha'am hazeh 700 ish bahur. Of all this force, there were 700 choice men, iter yad yamino, who were lefties. Kol zeh kolea ba'even el ha'sa'ara velo yahati. Every one of them could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. So what is the text telling us about the people of Binyamin? They're a force to be reckoned with, exactly. They are well trained, they are strong, they have decent weaponry, and they know how to use it. There's an interesting little detail here that's thrown out, that they were left-handed, right? And the reader kind of wonders, why mention the idea of left-handedness, right?
It's because if they're left-handed, they're not thinking, oh, which way they're going to go, because right-handed people tend to react and act in a certain way.
So the fact that they were left-handed, which seems to be an oddity of that time, something that was unique to this tribe, that's an element of surprise, perhaps, a tactic they could use to their advantage as far as warfare is concerned. But also think back to the beginning of our book, if you could go into the recesses of your memory over here, who we learned about a particular judge who was also left-handed. All the way back, one of the first judges of our book, right after Otniel ben Kenaz. It turned out to be the second of our judges. His name was Ehud ben Gera. Ehud ben Gera ruled over the Jewish, he was the leader of the Jewish people. He's one of the first judges who was considered a very righteous judge, who fought against Eglon Melech Moab, against the Moabites. And he ruled over the Jewish people for 80 years, the longest tenured judge that we saw in our book. His name was Ehud ben Gera. He's considered one of the more righteous judges in our book. He's from that first level, first section, before things sort of spiraled out of control. What tribe was Ehud ben Gera from? Well, if he was left-handed, and the text mentions it over here, he was from the tribe of Binyamin. So again, the book seems to be coming full circle, and we'll see other hints to this as well. As Shemuel is wrapping up the discussion here, he's bringing everything full circle and just putting into the reader's mind, remember where we once were with Ehud ben Gera, this amazing leader who freed the Jewish people from the clutches of the Moabites, from this oppressive king, Eglon Melech Moab, and did so with tremendous compassion for his people. He led the way, he put himself on the front lines, and now look where we're at. That same ferocity that existed in Ehud ben Gera that he put towards his enemies, his tribe now has spiraled so far out of control that they're going to put that same ferocity and that element of surprise against their own brothers. So it's again particularly painful to read about the status of the tribe of Binyamin, which at one point had one of the very leaders of the Jewish people, Ehud ben Gera, who used his left-handedness to liberate the Jewish people, and now is using it to attack his own brothers. It's particularly painful. And the text continuously is going to allude to this pain that we have at where both sides in this battle have come. Let's go to verse 17. Verse 17. By the way, before we finish that, in verse 16, the last words when it says that they had the ability, the Benjaminites had the ability to sling a stone and not miss, the language is velo yahati. What is the root of the word yahati in Hebrew? Chet, which means what? Sin. Isn't it ironic? Really what a het is, we translate it as sin, but het simply means to miss your mark, right? That's why it means like more something that's more accidental. You were aiming for one thing and you missed, right? So we use that in our context to talk about when someone does something wrong. I intended to do one thing and I made a mistake. I did something else. It's an inadvertent action, either inadvertent because I didn't know or inadvertent because I didn't intend for that to happen. All different reasons why it could be a mistake. We call that a het. You basically missed your mark, right? We're saying over here that the Benjaminites knew how to sling a stone and not be mahati and not miss their mark. But the irony of the use of that word is it sounds like they knew how to sling the stone and not sin. And think of the sin that they just performed. A, in what their clan did. B, not bringing them to justice. And C, they're going to decimate thousands of their own kinsmen. So many ironies, both textually and thematically, going on in this painful ironies happening over here in this chapter. Let's move forward into verse 17. Ve'ish Yisrael hotpakedu levad mi Binyamin 400,000 ish sholev harev. The men of Israel, other than Benjamin, mustered 400,000 fighting men, warriors to a man, as we said. Kol ze ish milchama. They were all men of war as well. So this is building up to be a pretty intense fight. Verse 18. Vayakumu vaya'alu Bet El. Now we see something interesting. The members of the other 11 tribes go to Bet El. They go to the house of God. Vayish'alu belohim, and they ask advice from Hashem. They're going to ask the Urim v'Tumim, where the Kohen Gadol is and where the Mishkan is. Vayomeru b'nei Yisrael, and the Jewish people say, Mi ya'aleh lanu b'tehillah. Which tribe should be in the front to battle out against the milchama in Bnei Binyamin, in this fight against Binyamin? Vayomer Adonai, and God says to them through this Urim v'Tumim, Yehuda b'tehillah. Yehuda is going to be first. Vayakumu b'nei Yisrael baboker. The Jews get up in the morning. Vayahanu al hagivah, and they encamp against Giv'ah, ready to fight. Herein lies another textual reference back to the beginning of our book. If you want, you can skip all the way back to the very first chapter of our book, how the book of Judges opens, and we will read it. I will show it to everybody in a minute. The book of Judges opens, the very first pasuk, chapter 1, verse 1. I'll open it up here for those in the Zoom who are watching. Just give me a minute. The book of Judges has number 1. Yeah, it says, Vahi acharei mot Yehoshua. It was after the death of Yehoshua. Vayish'alu b'nei Yisrael b'Adonai le'emor. The Jews came to God and asked, Mi ya'aleh lanu, who will go up first? El haKenaani b'techila, to fight against the Canaanites. If you remember back at that point, the Jews had not fully rid the influence of the Canaanim from the land of Israel. So something Yehoshua lamented that many tribes did not do. Lehilachim bo. And here comes another painful irony. So we opened the book of Judges with a Canaanite enemy who we did not rid, who we were lax against getting rid of them. And we asked God, who should go up first? And what does God answer? Vayomer Adonai, Yehuda ya'aleh. Yehuda should be the first one to go and to attack. Hine natati et haaretz biyado. Behold, I have put the land into his hand. Yehuda will be conquered, will be successful in their conquest. The book of Judges opens with an identity against the Canaanites and ridding our land of the Canaanites. And who's going to fight first against the Canaanites? And where do we end? Who's going to go first to attack? Binyamin. Who's going to be the first one to lead the way in a battle against our own brothers? How painful is that? It's coming full circle, but not in the way that we would have hoped it would be envisioned in that way. So again, like we said, many positives coming out here in what we're trying to do, which is rid the evil from the Jewish people. But because of all of the chaos that has been going on in so many of these chapters, look where we've bottomed out to. It's particularly difficult to put it into context. Let's go to verse 20. We will see even more. It's not going to end here. The Shemuel was a master in writing this to not leave any stone unturned for the reader to understand the gravity of what's taking place here. In verse 20, Vayetze ish Yisrael milchama in Binyamin. So seemingly at the word of God, the Jews go out to war. And as God instructed, Yehuda is going to lead. Vayarchu itam ish Yisrael milchama ela Giv'ah. And the men of Israel drew there into battle against the tribe of Binyamin in Giv'ah. So we have our first example of Jewish civil war. Verse 21, Vayetzeu b'nei Binyamin min ha'Giv'ah. The tribe of Binyamin comes out from their Giv'ah. Vayashhitu b'Yisrael b'yom hahu, and they slaughter from the Jewish people on that day, Shenayim ve'esrim elef, 22,000 men, ish arza. We lose 22,000 members of the rest of the tribes of Israel that were killed at the hands of the tribe of Binyamin. This is a terrible tragedy on all accounts, but it's particularly difficult to understand. Why did they lose? God told them to go. It's only going to get worse. Verse 22, they strengthened themselves. In other words, we lost that battle. They picked themselves up, all of the members of Yisrael, and they decide we're going to give it a second shot. The same way they did it on the first day. And they're not going to be successful. But look at how they're not going to be successful despite verse 23. The Jews come and they go up to the house of God and they cry to Hashem all day and all night. And they ask God again, should we continue to go to war against the people of Binyamin? Amongst the tribe of Binyamin, our brothers. God says, Alu elav. Yes, go a second time. Okay, certainly now you think, if God's telling us to go a second time, and they're crying and they're doing teshuvah, certainly they'll be successful. Verse 24, Jews of the tribes of Israel come upon the tribe of Binyamin on the second day, and once again, they're defeated. Verse 25. The tribe of Binyamin comes out to greet them in Hagivah from their place, Bayom HaSheni, and they slaughter even more from the Jewish people. Shemonat asar elef, this time 18,000 people, bringing the death toll to a whopping 40,000 people Binyamin has killed. Kol ele sholfei hareb, all of them were fighting men. So the reader is baffled over here. Here we have the Jews, the 11 tribes, gathering together for a noble cause to rid this evil and wickedness from the tribes of Binyamin, from amongst Am Yisrael. They ask God once. God seems to tell them to go. Let Judah go first. They lose 22,000. They cry and weep all night, and they ask God a second time, and God says, go again, and they lose 18,000 this time. What in the world is going on over here? The reader is perplexed. Why is this happening? But then why is God, they're asking God, why is God continuously instructing them to go and they're not going to be successful? You want to say this is the retribution that they deserve? Nobody's lost from Binyamin. It's a little baffling. Yeah. Well, let's read to the end and we'll certainly see that. We're verse 26. We'll read to the end and then maybe we'll double back to this question. But you can, as the reader, what's going on over here, right? It's pretty bothersome. Verse 26. All of the Jewish people go up again together with the people. They come again to the house of God. They sit and they cry in front of God. And they fast on that day till the evening. They bring sacrifices, peace offerings, burnt offerings in front of God. And a third time they ask God, and now the text tells us that the Aron, the Ark of God, right, where the covenant is held, is with them on those days. So maybe maybe the first few times they asked, they didn't ask with the Aron. Maybe they didn't ask with the Kohen Gadol. We'll see is now on the scene. So we're getting some more details that the situation is escalating as far as the Jews' efforts to understand what's happening over here. Verse 28, Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aharon omed lefanav. And now Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aharon, is standing in front of them. Now, this is already very interesting, right? Pinchas is alive, right? Now, if we go with the Radak's approach that this is happening all the way at the end of the period of the Shofetim, this means that Pinchas is somewhere in the 400 years old, right? Because he was alive in the desert, which means that he was alive during the time period of the desert, 40 years. He's alive through, Yeshua's conquest of the land, another 14 years. And now he's alive through 300 plus years of the Mishkan, and he's still alive. So Pinchas may have lived an exceedingly long life. Or this is happening earlier, much earlier in the time of the judges, as Rashi originally intimated to us, which then makes the timeline slightly more palatable as far as real timelines and lifetimes exist. So anyway, we'll leave that on the side. Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aharon, who's the Kohen Gadol, is standing in front of them on that day, and he asks, "Ha'osif od latzet lamilchama im bnei Binyamin achi im ehdal." Should we continue to go to war against our brothers from Benjamin, or should we desist? Vayomer Adonai, and God says, "Alu ki mahar etenenu biyadecha." Go, for tomorrow I'm going to put them into your hands. Now God gives an unequivocal answer. Yes, you should go, but not just go. God says, I'm going to make you successful. Now, that's an interesting indicating detail. That was missing from the last two times they asked. The last two times they asked, they just said, should we go up to war? Or who? First time they asked is, who should go up to war? They didn't even ask, should we? They said, who should go up to war? So God said, fine, let Yehuda go. That doesn't mean they were going to be successful, right? The second time they say, should we continue to go? God says, go. Doesn't say whether they're going to be successful. Now, the way Pinchas formulates the question, they want more of an answer. God, are we going to be successful? And here God tells them, you're going to be successful. So God gives them a full answer according to their question. Verse 29, Vayasim Yisrael orvim el hagiv'ah saviv. But this time, the Jewish people go with a little bit more of a strategy. They're going to make an ambush now to attack the Binyamin. What I'd like to do for a minute before we read about the actual battle in which they're successful is to pause and put out some commentaries about why the Jews lost the two battles, because that was a pressing question that we've had all along. So I'd like to, with your permission, read to you a little bit of what Rabbi Hatton has here from the classical commentaries and then what he offers as well, because I think his explanation is really good. So the first thing he offers is the Radak. So he says the following. Commentaries, ancient and modern, have attempted to answer this question with only partial success, the question of why they lost. I think he quotes Rashi before that, but I don't know. He says, Radak, echoing Rashi and drawing on an ancient tradition from the Talmud, offers the following formulation. The rabbis explained that this punishment of defeat befell Israel because of the transgression of Micha's idol that happened at the time. So they take the approach that the reason why they lost, as you kind of hinted to, Esther, with the fact that they deserved it. Why did they deserve it? Because of the idol of Micha. Now, what about was it the idol of Micha? It wasn't just that they had the idol of Micha that we read in chapter 17 and 18, and that they housed it and that they worshipped it and so on and so forth. It was the fact that now they only woke up to the problems and they didn't wake up back then. He says, behold, Israel was zealous for the matter of the concubine at Giv'ah. Look at how much energy and passion they had for this situation of the concubine at Giv'ah, but they were not zealous to extirpate the idol of Micha. But they did nothing when it came to Micha's idol. They embraced it. God's not happy with that, right? You do all of this for the woman at Giv'ah, and I get it. It's terrible, travesty. But there was nothing when the idol of Micha was going on. They should have been zealous and attacked the tribe of Dan in order to destroy that shrine from Israel, just as they destroyed this evil. Where were you to uproot the evil in the times of Micha? Therefore, they were punished in this conflict. Members needed to die in this conflict. The Holy One, blessed be He, said to them, you did not protest when it came to my honor. When it comes to the honor of flesh and blood, you now protest? It sounds as though God is saying, if this is how you react when it comes to people, why didn't you react this way when it comes to my honor? Now, that's the Radak's approach. It makes sense, but it has some holes. Any holes that you could think of? One hole for me, something that bothers me with this interpretation, is typically we have many rabbinic sources that show that God cares more about the way we treat each other than the way we treat Him. God can overlook, in some instances, corruption in the areas of avodah zarah, as long as we are getting along and as long as we are treating each other properly. So the way that Adak formulates it is God saying you need to be punished because you only woke up now when it came to your people, but you didn't wake up when it came to me, which I get, but it sounds almost as if God's saying, I care more about myself than I care more about what you're doing to each other, right? Meaning the answer to that should be, well, God, I get it. We should have done something, but what does that mean? You don't want us to do anything about this? In other words, at least be happy with the fact that we care, that we won't let people behave this way towards each other. So that bothered me a little bit. I don't think it's a great hole in the Radak's explanation, but that bothered me a little bit that we would take an isolated incident of the idol of Micha and infuse it into this and criticize the Jewish people for getting upset about here when they didn't get upset about there, when, sometimes God overlooks that when it comes to the relationships between Ben Adam LaMakom and Ben Adam LaChavero. You were going to say something before, no? Yeah. In this interpretation, the defeat of the tribes of Israel in the first two battles against Benjamin is not due to any failure on their part insofar as the immediate context is concerned. In other words, nothing to do with what they're doing now. The tribes of Israel are liable due to another unrelated indiscretion, their tolerance for the idolatrous shrine of Micha that continued to function for as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. This explanation has the advantage of strengthening the linkage that we noted earlier, the idol of Micha and the concubine of Giv'ah. We had these chapters back to back, so it makes sense that these chapters appear back to back according to the Radak, because one kind of leads into the other. This is what happens when you have idolatry. The idol of Micha and the concubine of Giv'ah are not simply two terrible episodes narrated at the conclusion of the book that together highlights the risk of weak government and the downward moral spiral of the people of Israel. According to this reading, there is an intrinsic link between the episodes. The first constitutes an affront against God, the second an affront against man. And when you let the affront against God go unpunished and unchecked, now it's a hop, skip, and not even a jump away to then starting to do that towards each other, right? And so that's this way that Adak reads, and there's definitely a lot that can be gained and learned from that reading. At the same time, the text nowhere actually draws a connection between Israel's defeat at Giv'ah and their intolerance for the idol of Micha. The Radak's explanation is somewhat missing proof from the text. We don't really see anywhere that the episodes are connected. We did say they both happen with Levi, they both go from Bethlehem to Ephraim or vice versa. So there are some hints, some subtleties, but nothing explicit that would lead the reader on his own, perhaps without this tradition, to link the two episodes together and say, this is why this is happening, right? So it does leave a little bit in that realm to be desired, right? Okay. He says, for example, Rabbi Hatton gives an example. He says, the last time we experienced a really bad defeat, and this is a concept we're going to bring up again a few times, is go all the way back to the book of Yehoshua in the battle against the Ai. One of the first battles that Yehoshua had, it's like chapter 8 or 9 in the book of Yehoshua, against the Ai, a very small tribe. And if you remember, that was coming right off the battle of Jericho. What happened? Achan, a member of the Jewish people, took from the spoils of war from what Yehoshua told them not to take. And as a result, 36 people died in the next battle against the Ai. And the Jewish people are up in arms. And they realize something's wrong. And the text exposes that the loss in battle was because Achan took from the spoils of war. And they kill Achan for it. So in that sense, the last time we lost a real bad battle, we knew why. The text made it abundantly clear someone had done something wrong, and as a result, we paid the price for it. That, if we're losing 40,000 people because of the idol of Micha, and we lost 36 people because of Achan taking the spoils, and there it mentions something and here it doesn't, it kind of calls into question whether or not that's a proper linkage. So these are all questions that sort of come about when you're reading this chapter that fall a little bit short in the Radak's explanation. For this reason, he offers another interpretation, a more technical one, which is the interpretation of the Ralbag, Rabbi Levi ben Gershom, although otherwise known as Gersonides. He writes the following. He gives a very technical point as to why they lost. He says a different answer is offered by Ralbag, who pays careful attention to the language employed when Israel inquired of God. The people of Israel said, "Who from among us shall go up first to battle Benjamin?" And God responded, "Judah shall be first." But they did not finish the inquiry for they should have asked, whether they would win or be defeated. They left that part of the question out. Why didn't they ask God, God, will we be successful? All they said was, who should go first? If God had told them that they would be defeated, they would not have engaged in battle. This is why setback befell them, because they did not inquire properly the first time or the second. However, the third time they did inquire properly. Shall I continue to go out to battle against my brother Benjamin, or shall I desist? This time the response was complete, and God said, go up tomorrow, I shall give them into your hands. For Al-Bag, there is a proper way to inquire of God, in which the questioner leaves nothing open-ended and no room for doubt. The error of the people is therefore not an axiological lapse, but rather a technical fault. In not phrasing their inquiry with watertight precision, the tribes of Israel left themselves open to misinterpretation of the divine response with all its tragic consequences. While this interpretation limits the scope of our immediate context and does not depend, like Radak, on extraneous and perhaps tenuous linkages. So one thing that Al-Bag benefits from is he doesn't need to connect it to the idol of Micha. This story stands on its own. It seems very, very bizarre that just because they didn't put that little detail into the question, 40,000 people have to die. That's a little bit extreme, don't you think? Right? He says it's also prepared to forfeit 40,000 lives for imprecise words. And that probably bothers us a little bit more than the other problems with Radak's interpretation.
I feel like we run into that before with improper wording. We didn't say it right, we didn't ask right, we didn't do even when they made the swears and the promises, everything always has that backlash.
It's true.
We don't do things.
Yes, there is a technical aspect to things. I'll give you an example. If you go into the Torah and the Jews were fighting against a nation called Kenani Melech Arad, right? They were fighting against one of the Canaanite kings who came to attack them when they were in the desert. The rabbis say that they were really Amalek dressed up as Canaanites, and the Jews didn't know who they were. So when they made a vow to God, they said, God, if you give this nation, they didn't say who it was because they weren't sure what nation they were. So when they made the vow, they wanted to be as technical as possible when it came to doing the vow, because if they would have said the nation, it was the wrong nation, God might not have helped them. So we do see in many different examples in Torah and in Tanakh that how you present something, especially when it comes to how you present it to God, how you phrase something, how you formulate it, is very, very important. So Al-Bag definitely has a lot to back himself on when it comes to that type of interpretation. But for the reader, I think for me, it's very tit for tat. It's very, very technical when you consider what was lost as a result of that. So 40,000 people die, 2 battles lost against wicked people who need to be defeated just because they didn't ask. And what would have happened if they did ask properly? Would God have told them, no, you're going to lose? Why should they have lost in the first place, right? In other words, something's not right over here. Al-Bag's interpretation, in my opinion, leaves a little bit more to be desired than even the Radak's interpretation. So what I'd like to do here is show you Rabbi Hatton's interpretation over here. He says the following: applying a literary approach to the problem yields a different solution, soundly based upon our earlier analysis that linked the battles against Giv'ah to the defeat of Ai in the book of Yehoshua. Remember, we just talked about the battle of Ai and Achan? By the way, that battle is going to get even more. We didn't read the Pisukim yet, and hopefully we will. I know we're running a little out of time, but the battle that they're going to do, the third battle that they're going to present over here, is going to be exactly the same formulation of the people of Ai. Do you remember what the battle of Ai was? I refresh our memories a little bit. No, it's hard because it's a while back. You'll remember it when I describe it to you, right? The battle of Ai, Yehoshua set up 2 fronts. What did he do? He set up a hidden ambush somewhere distant away from the city. And when they lost the first battle, they said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to pretend to lose the second battle. So Yehoshua took his army, they went out to fight, and they started to retreat. Intentionally, they started to retreat, pretending as if they were losing. What was the goal of this? When they started to retreat, the Ai started to say, oh, look, they're losing again. Let's go get them. And everybody's going to pour out of the city. And what's going to happen when they pour out of the city? The ambush is going to come out from behind, burn the city to the ground, kill all the people there. And now what do we have? We have a sandwich attack. We have the ambush coming from this way. We have Yehoshua, who's retreating is going to turn around with his people, and the Ai are going to be petrified to see their city in flames, which they abandoned, and two fronts of the Jewish people ready to attack them, and Am Yisrael are going to obliterate them. And that's exactly what happens in the Battle of the Ai. What's amazing is that's exactly what happens here in our chapter against the tribe of Binyamin. You know what? Maybe we'll take a pause from Rabbi Hanan for just a minute and quickly read the story as it's presented inside. I'm going to read it just in the English to save us a little bit of time because we're running short on our time, and I want to be mindful of that. And then we'll read Rabbi Hatton's explanation to close. He says, we're on verse 30. And on the third day, the Israelites went up against the Benjaminites as before and engaged them in battle in Giv'ah. Now, this time they have a promise that they're going to be successful. The Benjaminites dashed out to meet the army and were drawn away from the town onto the roads, of which one runs to Beth El and the other to Giv'ah. As before, they started out by striking some of the men dead in the open field, about 30 men of Israel. So there are some casualties in this instance, in the pretend retreat. The Benjaminites thought they are being routed before us as previously, but the Israelites had planned, we will take flight or retreat and draw them away from the town to the roads. And while the main body of the Israelites had moved away from their positions and had drawn up in battle order at Baal Tamar, the Israelite ambush was rushing out from its position at Ma'areh Giv'ah from the caves. The 10,000 picked men of all Israel came to a point south of Giv'ah, and the battle was furious before they realized that disaster was approaching. The Lord routed the Benjaminites before Israel. That day, the Israelites slew 25,100 men of Benjamin, all of them fighting men. So far in this entire war, the death toll is over 65,000 people between the first two losses of Israel and then the last loss of Benjamin. And that's just counting the losing side each time. The Benjaminites realized they were routed. Now the Israelites had yielded ground to the Benjaminites, for they relied on the ambush which they had laid against Giv'ah. One ambush quickly deployed against Giv'ah, and the other ambush advanced and put the whole town to the sword. A time had been agreed upon by the Israelite men with those in ambush when a huge column of smoke was sent up from the town. If you remember, going all the way back to the Battle of Ai in the time of Yehoshua, Yehoshua's sign was he raised his sword. When he raised his sword, they knew the ruse is up, turn around and fight. This time it was a column of smoke, very similar, some kind of upward visual. The Israelite men were to turn around in battle. Benjamin had begun striking dead about 30 Israelite men, and they thought they are being routed before us as in the previous fighting. But when the pillar of smoke began to rise from the city, the Benjaminites looked behind them, and there was the whole town going up in smoke to the sky. And now the Israelites turned about, and the men of Benjamin were thrown into panic, for they realized that disaster had overtaken them. They retreated before the men of Israel along the road to the wilderness, where the fighting caught up with them. Meanwhile, those from the towns were massacring them in it. They encircled the Benjaminites, pursued them, and trod them down from Menuha to a point opposite Giv'ah on the east. That day, 18,000 men of Benjamin fell, all of them brave men. So 25,000 up to another 18,000. They turned and fled to the wilderness, to the rock of Rimmon. But the Israelites picked off another 5,000 on the roads, and continuing in hot pursuit of them up to Gidom, and they slew 2,000 more. So excuse me, it's not another 18,000. The 25,100 we read about was the total number. How you break that down, it was 18,000 in battle, 5,000 who went away, and then another 2,000. All told, it's about 25,000. Thus, the total number of Benjaminites who fell that day came to 25,000 men, all of them brave. Notice that the text keeps repeating that. They're fighters, they're brave, but in the end of the day, it didn't stand for them. But 600 men turned and fled to the wilderness, to the rock of Rimmon. They remained at the rock of Rimmon 4 months. The men of Israel, meanwhile, turned back to the rest of the Benjaminites and put them to the sword, towns, people, cattle, everything that remained. Finally, they set fire to all the towns that were left. So it's an utter obliteration of the tribe of Binyamin. Remember how many people came out to the tribe of Binyamin? It was 26,000. We just had 25,100 with a few hundred remaining, which means the tribe of Binyamin is on the verge, on the precipice of being completely wiped out. There will not be any more members of Binyamin to account for a tribe if this continues in this way. So we're down to the less than 1,000 people left of the tribe of Binyamin at this point where we are. The tragedy is terrible.
So why was there a way that they could have, at that point, let's say sometime during this losing of the battle,
Salvage, maybe.
We give in,
It seems as though,
Like,
I don't know.
there be like,
I don't know. I don't know how the rules of engagement are, a ceasefire of some nature. It seems as though once the battle is on, it's very difficult to end the battle without a full out destruction. You know what I mean? The time to have averted the crisis was when they sent the delegation earlier in the chapter and they didn't follow. I don't know. I don't know how that would have gone. But basically where we currently stand at the end of chapter 20, and the chapter 21 we'll pick up with in our next shi'ur, which talking about how we deal with the aftermath, right, of this whole tragedy. How are the remaining people of Binyamin viewed? How are they going to rebuild their tribe, if at all? What was the rest of the climate for the rest of the Jewish people in their sides after 65,000 people have died in a civil war, the highest of any death toll we've had in the whole book of Shofetim? It's mind-blowing. And that's what chapter 21 is really going to have to pick up on. But the contents of this battle are eerily similar to exactly the strategy that Yehoshua planned out against our last fiercest enemy who was able to defeat us, was the people of the Ai. So that's what Rabbi Hatton plays on over here, the interplay between that battle and this battle. So I'll close with his words, and then next week we'll pick up chapter 21 with the aftermath of how are we going to pick up the pieces after this colossal tragedy. So again, he says, applying a literary approach to the problem yields a different solution, soundly based upon our earlier analysis that linked the battles against Giv'ah to the defeat of Ai in the book of Yehoshua. Recall that our text drew a parallel between Canaanite Ai and Israelite Giv'ah on the one hand, and between Joshua's army and the tribe of Israel on the other. In this analogy, the criminals from Benjamin are recast as Canaanites because of their diabolical behavior. That's the enemy. The enemy is Ai, the enemy is Benjamin. The protagonists are Yehoshua and us. Whereas the united tribes of Israel, noble and just, are like the fabled army of Joshua. But Joshua's army, in spite of its virtue, was defeated in their first skirmish with the defenders of the Ai and only prevailed the second time. The reason for their initial rout was because in their midst was an offender by the name of Achan, who had taken from the spoils of Jericho in spite of Yehoshua's explicit ban. It was only after Achan was extirpated that Yehoshua was victorious. So in between the battles, says Rabbi Haim, something happened. In between the loss and the win, something happened. In the case of Yehoshua and the Ai, in between the loss of the first battle and the victory of the second battle, they extirpated Achan. They got to the root of what caused them to lose, which was the fact that Achan took the spoils of war. They destroyed the spoils of war. They killed Achan. They did teshuvah. Now they're ready to fight. They cleansed themselves. The critical lesson from that story, as developed at length in our commentary in the book of Yehoshua, was that all of the people of Israel are responsible for each other. Notice how all of Am Yisrael lost because one guy took the spoils of war. You say that's not fair. Why should we all lose? We're all responsible for each other. Now you can see where he's going to draw it closer. And all the more so are the soldiers of Israel who fight shoulder to shoulder responsible for each other. Only Achan took from the spoils, but his family, his community, and the entire people had to share in his misdeed. This is not because these others were actively involved or even consciously aware of the crime. In reality, we know that this was not the case. Only Achan's small circle of family and friends were privy to the theft. Rather, responsibility here means the shaping of the social context that allows a person such as Achan to act. In other words, the climate was ripe for him to be able to do this. What kind of social environment contributes to and nurtures behavior such as that displayed by Achan? For Achan to do this, it means he learned it from somewhere. He saw someone else do it. He must have gotten it from the culture. If there's nothing about that in there, a person doesn't act that way. There's a root in here that everybody's responsible for. So even though you didn't do the sin, even though you didn't even know about the sin, you contributed to a culture which allows for that sin to be able to take place. And in that sense, when the sin happens, you're also responsible. So when someone does something in our community, in another community, when somebody does something wrong, and we're outraged, I would have never done that. The fact that it could happen is because we're a part of it. And that means we have to accept responsibility as well. What kind of social environment promotes and encourages behavior such as that is embraced by the miscreants of Giv'ah? Yes, it was only a small group amongst the people of Benjamin who did it, but everybody was responsible because they created the opportunity for them to do it. If that is the question, then responsibility, albeit attenuated form, lies with everyone. Effectively then, when the tribes of Israel are defeated in battle against Benjamin, even though we look at them as the good guys and Benjamin is the bad guys, it is a sure indication that they too are culpable. They're also responsible. This is kind of what you were saying before when you said they deserved it, right? And maybe that's kind of what Radak also means when he says it was because of the idol of Micha. In other words, they deserved it. Not necessarily of crimes of commission, but at least of crimes of omission. Like Achan, who brought ruin upon those who kept his company, there are many among the tribes who are not blameless. Notwithstanding their grand display of moral indignation now, oh yeah, they got up now to get rid of everybody, their exaggerated unity, the likes of which has not been seen since the book of Joshua. Right? They have exaggerated unity. They're excited to kill other people from their own tribes. How many injustices have the tribes of Israel overlooked since our sorry account began? How many vulnerable people have been oppressed, hapless victims abused, and acts of evil countenanced or endorsed to have brought us to this moment? Yeah, Pilegesh Begiv'ah is the straw that broke the camel's back. It's the most horrific of all of them. But it's hard to imagine that this happened in a vacuum. The likelihood is there was a buildup to where we got to this point. And everybody is responsible for a buildup in which something like this has the possibility of happening. To have handily defeated Benjamin on the first attempt would have implied Israel's ethical superiority. To be mightily defeated twice markedly levels the moral playing field. In other words, had the Jews gone and attacked Binyamin and God helped them destroy them the first time, what would everybody have said at the end of the battle? You see, the Jews did the good thing, Binyamin was wrong, these were the good guys, these were the bad guys. By making them lose twice before they actually win, the message here is nobody won. Yeah, in the end of the day, Binyamin was decimated, and yeah, in the end of the day, but nobody won. Nobody comes out a winner in this battle because everybody's culpable. Everybody's responsible. Am Yisrael as a whole have acted deplorably, have broken themselves down, and as a whole need to be repaired. And so everybody's responsible, everybody's culpable. Yeah, they did it, but we allowed it to happen, and we allowed this to come. I think back, and I know I could get in trouble for saying this, but I think back a few summers to when there was a really bad incident in our community with the party and this and that. And at that point, everybody turned around and said, no, we have to do something to these people. We have to get rid of them. We have to this, we have to that. And as rabbis, we turned around and said, well, this didn't happen overnight. It's not as if our community has been so perfect and everything, and all of a sudden one guy, no, this has been a buildup consistently of allowing more and more and more things that are not according to our values and principles to occur, too much tolerance for it, push that little line back and back and back because it's not so bad, it's not this, it's not that. We tolerated it, we bent, and then eventually someone took it to a point which is, oh, okay, well, now we're all in shock. Even everybody else, we can't tolerate it. And everybody all of a sudden stood up as if righteous to say, we would never allow that, that's terrible, that's the worst thing. But those were the same people who made the same types of events that allowed the culture to be as such for such a thing to take place. So when something like that happens and we're outraged and we're saying, how could this happen? Yeah, it happened, but it doesn't happen overnight. You have to look at yourself and you have to say, well, what part did I contribute into this? Maybe I threw a part, maybe I did this, maybe I did that allowed the culture to get ever more tilted this way. Slightly pushed the boundary. Yeah, the boundary got moved from here to here overnight, but if it didn't get here because it was here, it wouldn't have gotten there in the beginning, right? So, I hope everybody understands, and that's just one example, but I think a takeaway from here is Jews fighting against each other is a tragedy in all cases. 65,000 people die, more than any other battle we've ever had anywhere else, and it happened because we allowed ourselves to get to that point. We allowed things to be tolerated. We allowed the nevalah to take place. And as a result, the lesson I think for us is when things go wrong, we can't have tolerance for that. If we allow the culture to continue that way, when things get out of hand, we can't just point the finger and say it was their fault. It's everybody's fault. We're all part of it. So we're still not at a high point. We're still, it's still very much a dark reading and a dark study. And hopefully we're getting our way towards the end of the book of Shofetim, where then we'll be able to climb out of it. Chapter 21 is about the aftermath of this episode, rebuilding the tribe of Benjamin. How are we going to deal with them? How are we going to pick up the pieces of the shattered, broken glass? That will be our last study for the final chapter of the book of Shofetim. And then brighter days are ahead as we turn to the book of Shemuel and the bring up of a king, of Yerushalayim, of Beit HaMikdash, and many more happy situations, hopefully as Am Yisrael climb out of the depths into brighter and better days ahead. Questions, comments? I know we're very late, but I thank everyone for sticking with us. Okay, we'll see everybody next week. Well, next week is Monday. We have Shavuot, so we'll be in 2 weeks.